10W-30 used to sit in almost every engine in America. Not because oil companies pushed it, not because mechanics defaulted to it out of habit, because engines of that era were actually built for it. Walk into any shop between 1965 and 1985 and you would find 10W-30 on the shelf, in the bay, and in the drain pan. It was not a suggestion. It was the oil. Understanding why requires knowing something most people have never been told about how engines were actually built back then. The tolerances were wider. That is the starting point for all of this. A crankshaft bearing clearance in a 1972 Ford 302 was typically between 1.5 and 2.5 thousandths of an inch. Modern engines run tighter, some down to 0.8 or 0.9 of a thousandth. Wider clearances need thicker oil to fill the gap and maintain what engineers call the hydrodynamic wedge. That is the film of oil that physically separates moving metal from moving metal. Too thin an oil in a wide clearance engine and that wedge collapses under load. 10W-30 filled that wedge. It was calibrated to that generation of engines. But the real reason 10W-30 was prime has almost nothing to do with viscosity. It has to do with chemistry. The American Petroleum Institute service categories running through those decades carried a minimum level of zinc dialkyldithiophosphate. In engine oil chemistry, zinc dialkyldithiophosphate is the compound that prevents metal-on-metal wear during cold starts and under high-pressure contact. It is the most important anti-wear additive in the bottle. In a 1975 10W-30 oil, zinc dialkyldithiophosphate levels typically ran between 1,200 and 1,500 parts per million. That was not accidental. Flat tappet camshafts, which were standard in virtually every pushrod engine of that era, create a sliding wiping contact between the cam lobe and the lifter. High pressure, high heat, and high speed all at once. Without adequate zinc dialkyldithiophosphate at those contact points, the cam lobe wipes itself smooth within the first 5,000 miles. The engine still runs. It just does not make power anymore, and nobody can figure out why. 10W-30 of the 1970s was formulated to survive that contact. The modern version on the shelf today is not the same product. In 1975, the Clean Air Act established catalytic converter requirements for new vehicles. Zinc dialkyldithiophosphate is a phosphorus-containing compound. Phosphorus poisons catalytic converters over time. So, the American Petroleum Institute, responding to pressure from manufacturers, began reducing the allowable zinc dialkyldithiophosphate ceiling in each new service category. By the time the most recent service categories arrived in the 2000s, that ceiling had dropped to around 800 parts per million. That is nearly half what those 1970s formulations carried. Same name on the bottle, different compound profile inside it. This is where the consumer protection problem starts. Someone restoring a 1969 Camaro with a 396 cubic inch block goes to the auto parts store, picks up a bottle labeled 10W-30, assumes it is the correct choice because that is what the owner's manual says, and pours in an oil that was never designed for flat tappet camshaft chemistry. The zinc dialkyldithiophosphate level is too low. The cam lobe starts to wear. By 30,000 miles, the engine has measurably lost compression on multiple cylinders. They think they rebuilt the engine wrong. They did not. They used the wrong oil. 10W-30 was prime because the whole system was calibrated together. The clearances, the chemistry, the engine architecture, and the service category were one coherent package. You cannot pull one element out of that package and expect the others to compensate. There are ways to address this today. High zinc dialkyldithiophosphate racing oils, certain diesel-rated oils which still carry elevated zinc levels under separate service categories, and specific products marketed for flat tappet and classic engines all put zinc dialkyldithiophosphate back above 1,000 parts per million. Most camshaft manufacturers specify that threshold as the minimum for break-in on a fresh flat tappet build. But the lesson from 10W-30 is broader than camshaft chemistry. It is that oil recommendations age with the engine. The owner's manual was correct for the oil that existed when it was written. That oil no longer exists under the same name. If you own a vehicle built before 1996, your oil specification conversation needs to start with what those engines actually require chemically, not just what label was printed in a 40-year-old service manual. That is the thing nobody tells you at the counter. And it is the thing that separates a well-preserved classic from one that quietly destroys itself from the inside.